The year is 1980. After a long and protracted guerrilla war, Zimbabwe has finally obtained its independence, and at its helm is a very visionary and idealistic young man by the name of Robert Gabriel Mugabe. He was there in the trenches fighting alongside other comrades as they were trying to bring freedom and equality to the land of Zimbabwe. After the war, Mugabe promised the white minority that they would retain their land, they would retain their rights, they won't be ill-treated, nobody would be put in jail. Even Ian Smith, the architect of the UDI, would not even be put in jail. He preached a message of reconciliation, a message of peace, a message of hope. Subsequently, after gaining independence, he was even knighted by the British Queen as a sign of goodwill and a sign of good relations between the West and the young and burgeoning nation of Zimbabwe. Fast forward 10 years from independence, we are in the 90s. In the 1990s, the economy of Zimbabwe begins to deteriorate. According to my own assessment, the deterioration of the economy can be attributed to factors such as a very large social services program, building of schools, clinics, which was done without enough money to finance those projects. Corruption, evidenced by scandals such as the Willowvale scandal, and corruption that was just endemic in the government as ministers, MPs, people in positions of power were siphoning money from their government for their own personal use. Fast forward 10 years again, we are in the 2000s. The country is really begin to deteriorate economically. There is a drought, and people begin to really notice that there are cracks appearing in this independent Zimbabwe of ours. Those guerrillas who had fought against the British begin to claim compensation. They begin to claim that they need to have land, which was, according to me, a very valid claim. How could we have independence without land? But the way they got around to giving people land was really controversial, which resulted in the West handing us many and varied sanctions. So, as the economy was deteriorating, the guerrilla fighters, the veterans, were claiming their piece of the pie. What did Mugabe do? He began to print more money so as to provide compensation for those war veterans. However, printing of money, unsurprisingly, led to hyperinflation. Also, he saw that the method they were using of obtaining back the land was not really effective. They were using the method of willing buyer, willing seller, and no white farmer was willing to sell his farm at whatever price. They were keeping a very tight grip on the land. So, what did Mugabe do? Well, what did he let happen? According to my own assessment, the state Chimrenga, the land repatriation, the appropriation of land without payment was initiated by the war veterans themselves. They went to the farms, they took the farms, and Mugabe just sat idly by. Then the West looked at him and said, why aren't you stopping those people? And really, that is when the relationship between Mugabe and the West went south. He then fearlessly proclaimed that it's our land. We have to take it back. It was stolen from our ancestors. And it's time. It's long overdue. Time is long overdue. We have to take back the land. And indeed, we took back the land. So, as we took back the land, sanctions really were increased. And the West looked at Zimbabwe as a pariah state, a rogue nation. Fortunately, we didn't have oil. If we had oil, I think Uncle Sam would have come and gave us a generous helping of freedom, just like they did recently in Libya, just like they did when they toppled Gaddafi. I think my country would be greatly facing instability and maybe a civil war. But thankfully, we don't have anything of value. So the US and the West, they just gave a sanctions regime and ignored as the people of Zimbabwe were suffering. It is really funny to note that the West, preaches about freedom, and the UN preaches that they are there to protect human rights. But as the situation in Zimbabwe began to deteriorate, Mugabe changed from the stalwart of human rights, freedom, and advocate for peace. He changed, and he became, in all meanings or definitions of the word, he became a dictator. And in 2008, the situation had reached such a fever pitch that 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars could not buy anything, and the people of Zimbabwe were very, 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 very peeved at their government, and they decided to elect the opposition party, Morgan Tsvangirai, to be the president and maybe take the country in a very different direction from what Mugabe was doing. Unfortunately, the opposition party could not reach 51%, which was required in the constitution, so that person could become president, and a runoff election was to be held. It is during this runoff election that the true colors of this dictator became evident. I myself bore witness to vast and unimaginable infringement of human rights. People were taken from their workplaces, beaten up. When you went to vote, you had to say, I could not write, even though you were the headmaster of a school. You had to say, I cannot write, so that you could prove that you have voted for the ruling party. Because if you didn't vote for them, they really promised that people would die, people would get beaten. The political violence was just at an unimaginable level. And as I grew up, I was born in the 90s, I had this perception that my country was peaceful and that the people really could not be that violent and savage. But I really saw a different side of my countrymen that I would really not want to witness again. So people were beaten up, people were killed, houses were burned, to oversimplify. And predictably, Mugabe kept his grip on power. It is after this election that he descended to actual lunacy. The policies that he began to implement, for example, 51% ownership of all companies, mines, any kind of business that was going on, it has to be 51% owned by the natives, which sounded like a good thing on paper, but really all that it meant was that 51% was to be owned by ZANU-PF and those who supported him, his nephews, his kinfolk. Anyone who was not linked to him did not have a piece of the pie. So all these policies were just beneficial to him, and this is when things really began to go south. The legacy of Robert Mugabe is a legacy that has been tainted by what he did after the repatriation of land. And it is sad to note that a person who started so well with such good intentions ended up being such a hated dictator. And even as he died last year, he won't be missed because of what he did and the situation he left us in. He left us in the very incapable hands of his junior comrade whom he tried to chase during his last days when he was ousted in a coup. But really, he trained him. All that he knows, the modus operandi that he uses, is classic Mugabe style minus the intelligence. Because even though Mugabe was a dictator, he used soft power and he used force. He would go on television and really comfort and try to give hope to the nation, while at the same time he would send the army to beat up all people who dissented. But currently, he left us in a regime which does not use soft power. And it's sad to note that what started as a nation full of hope, what started as a nation full of promise, what started as the breadbasket of Africa has turned into a begging basket, and we are desperate and destitute. That is the legacy that he has left for us. And as I said, he won't be missed. Despite all the good he did, it was good to return back the land, but the way they went around about it was really appalling. He will be remembered for the political violence. He will be remembered for the hunger, for the starvation. He will be remembered for the hyperinflation. He will be remembered for the potholes. His legacy is really tainted. This has been Jiggy Speaks.